I'm going to talk to you today about symbolism, um, a, a movement that is much less coherent than, say, Impressionism, artists exhibiting together, a movement that in art was spread across Europe and involved the activities, the interests, the artistic productions of a great variety of artists working in both quite traditional and more avant-garde styles. Now, symbolism at this time in cultural history means something different than say, prior to the 19th century. You're all familiar with a symbol um, as being a thing that refers to something else. But before the late 19th century, um, symbols had conventional meanings. There was a kind of one-to-one equivalence between the thing and what it was to represent. The dove, for example, seen in a religious context, could be, one could confidently say that that was to represent the Holy Spirit. That was a broadly known, broadly understood symbol. So we could say that the meaning there is closed. Um, in a religious context, the dove stands for the Holy Spirit, and not something else. But in late 19th century symbolism, there isn't that one-to-one equivalence. Meaning is open-ended. Um, Meaning is suggestive and ambiguous. Now, there are some examples of this before the 19th century, and I would say one of them is the painting by Giorgione called The Tempest. And you'll recall that we see there a near naked woman nursing a child on one side of the painting in the foreground, and a halberdier, a soldier, holding a halberd on the other side of the painting. There's lightning in the background. There's a broken column behind the halberdier. The landscape is rather rank and overgrown, and so how these things go together is unclear. The painting suggests that there might be some link, some underlying meaning, and as a result, art historians have written over and over about that painting, trying to interpret it in some coherent way. Well, this sort of open-endedness in meaning, this suggestiveness that these things stand for something else, becomes commonplace in the late 19th century, in the new kind of symbolism, which is more personal, which includes elements of fantasy and free association, rather than the clear one-to-one equivalence that was fairly commonplace, certainly among the learned, among the educated in the art of the Renaissance and the Baroque periods, right up to the later 19th century. Let's take a look at a work. I'm going to put a work on the screen so you have something else to look at. We're looking at Redon's painting of Orpheus, which is a really stunning and exemplary work of symbolism. I want to mention that symbolism in the late 19th century was linked to a literary movement that was more or less contemporaneous with its beginnings in the visual arts. The poet Jean Mauriac published a document regarded as the Symbolist Manifesto in 1886. And in that document, he rejects the naturalism of Zola and the writers of his generation. The manifesto declares its adherents to be enemies of education, declamation, wrong feelings, and objective description. I think that last phrase is particularly telling, objective description. The manifesto underscores the primacy of the idea, the underlying idea, that's the important thing, and asserts that it asserts truth in excess and extravagance, truth in apparent chaos and insanity, truth in subjective experience, as well as the danger of platitudes and natural banality. It urges poets, and by implication also artists, to be ever more audacious, and to guard against the risk of what was once rebellious becoming conformist. Symbolism was influenced by Romanticism, and with its exalting of the emotions and freedom of expression, as well as the poet Baudelaire, who lived, you'll recall, in the early and mid 19th century, and whose artistic ideal was Delacroix. It was Baudelaire's view that the whole of the visible universe is only a storehouse of images and signs to which the imagination assigns a place and a relative value. It is a kind of nourishment that the imagination must digest and transform. I want to read to you most of, if not all, a poem by Paul Verlaine, a poet associated with the Symbolist movement. This is called The Art of Poetry, and it goes like this. Let music come first, and for this I choose an odd meter, vaguer and more evanescent, weightless and unaffected. And you must not select your words without some vagueness. Nothing is more precious than the gray song that joins the uncertain to the precise. Such are beautiful eyes behind veils. Such is the full trembling daylight at noon. Such in a warm fall sky is the blue confusion of bright stars. For we still want nuance, not color, nothing but nuance. Only nuance affiances dream to dream and the flute to the horn. Flee far from the murderous thrust, cruel wit and impure laughter that make the azure cry, and all this garlic of lowly cooking. Seize eloquence and wring its neck. You will do well while you are at it to make rhyme a little more orderly, for if one does not watch, how far will it go? Oh, who will tell what is wrong with rhyme? What deaf child or mad Negro has molded this cheap jewel that sounds hollow and false under a file? Music, again and always. May your verse take wing like a departed soul that flees, one feels, toward other skies, other loves. May your verse be a prophecy cast into the taut morning wind, scented with mint and thyme, and all the rest is literature. All right, so the poem, well, at the very end, it disdains literature, and one might imagine again the novels of Zola. It disdains clarity and seems to champion instead nuance, subtlety, things that are like music. Of course, music, you recall, was much appreciated for its vagueness, for the freedom of response that it allowed to the listener. All right. So let's look at some works of art. We're looking here at a work by Odilon Redon, and I want to back up here now a few images. Redon lived a long life between 1840, or in the same year as Monet, and died in 1916. He was much influenced by music, and if you recall the article of mine that you read at the very beginning of the semester about music influence on various painters ends with some discussion of Redon. Redon was a very capable violinist. He could have been perhaps a professional musician had he not chosen the path of art. He says about his childhood, there's not a recollection of my early childhood which is not linked to melody, to music of quality. Later, as an adolescent, I listened to then still little-known works by Berlioz, Schumann, Chopin. Our family home was filled with it. Music certainly left its mark on my soul. And ultimately, it was not the experience of music. It was not representing people listening, people playing music as Degas did in his art, but it was rather the ambiguity of music that really appealed to him, that he tried to find equivalents for in the visual arts. It was not music's logical structure, but the open-endedness and ambiguity of meaning that afforded the listener a rich subjective experience. And Redon said, again, I'm quoting my own article here, The art of suggestion exists whole in the exciting art of music and more freely and radiantly, but it is also mined by a combination of several elements brought together, of forms transposed, of forms transformed, without any relationship to contingencies, but having nonetheless a certain logic. As your textbook explains, Renault was really rather late in exhibiting his art. Not until he was almost 40 did he exhibit. And initially what he produced were lithographs and drawings. And so we're seeing a drawing here on the screen. He had attempted to study architecture at the École des Beaux-Arts, but failed the entrance exams. Perhaps he wasn't really interested. He briefly studied in Paris with Jean-Léon Gérôme, and then returned to his home of Bordeaux in the far south of France. And there he studied sculpture, etching, and lithography with an artist by the name of Rodolphe Bredin. He moved back to Paris then after the Franco-Prussian War, and as I said, exhibited only in 1879 a set of prints which were entitled Dans le Rêve, in the Dream. And the following year, in 1880, he gave his first show at the offices of La Vie Moderne. He exhibited in the 8th Impressionist exhibition, but not before 1886 with the Impressionists. The work on the screen is entitled The Convict, dating from 1881. This is a drawing in charcoal, a drawing of about 2 feet by 21 inches in size. And this is like a lot of Redon's early drawings in being rather macabre, dark, even grotesque in subject matter, although always very delicately depicted. So we see a single figure here who is looking through the bars of a cell, and he's all twisted up in an accordion-like pose. Really seems to have climbed the bars of the cell and points out at us. Our work then very effectively rendered in light and dark tones with charcoal, with the right-hand side of the image fading away into darkness, and the really searching, yearning, broken look of the convict who points toward us, staring out through the bars of the cell that pass right over his face. A little bit later, Redon got attention, was singled out in the novel by Huysmans called Au Rebord, which is sometimes translated as Against the Grain. And it's regarded as one of the most influential, certainly shocking novels of the late 19th century. And a number of composers and artists are singled out as producing work that is consistent with the taste of the decadent character who is at the center of the novel. And it was Bredin, but also Redon, and as well as Gustave Moreau. Those are the artists that are mentioned that this fictive character collects. And so the novel brought a lot of attention to Redon and elevated his status in the art world, in the opinion of collectors at the time. Around 1890, Redon shifted to pastels and oils. Those became his preferred medium. He did very few drawings thereafter. His drawings he called his noirs, and noir means black. So I'm showing you here a work in oil, which is entitled The Flight to Egypt. It may be something of a surprise to you, a shock, that here in the late 19th century, we've returned to the religious subject matter that had become more and more rare over the course of the 19th century. But there were a number of late 19th century artists interested in religious themes and in the numinosity, the kind of transcendent nature of religion, and not only Christianity, but also Eastern religions as well. Redon was interested in Buddhism, as well as mythology. But of course, we see the flight to Egypt depicted here in quite a novel way, with the Holy Family fleeing to Egypt shown as minimally defined figures within this aura of light, and the landscape through which they pass then is suggested in the most economical way, with a tree trunk and a few limbs, other delicate tree-like forms, um, and and these things are picked out in bands of light against the dark night sky and the dark landscape below. A minimalist image, but one that I think is highly effective in suggesting the danger, the vulnerability of the Holy Family, and their special nature shown through light in this dark landscape. I show you another print, and this one is called The Celestial Art by Redon. And I show this as an emblem of his reverence for music. So it's music, indeed. It is the celestial art. And we see music played here by a winged figure, an angelic figure, as a larger figure looks downward in the foreground. So it would seem that this figure is listening to music, perhaps playing music, and the music that is produced is represented in the angelic figure seen above in a sky-like area. Notice the delicacy of his technique, the figures drawn in thin, but very precise lines, and the shading also very delicately done. Redon, for all his interest in music, produced rather few images really about music or with music as their subject. Again, it was the open-ended nature of music, music's ambiguity, which inspired him to create images which were like music, but did not depict music. One other that I can show you, and this came up on the screen earlier, is this portrayal of Orpheus. Now you recall Orpheus is the brilliant virtuosic musician in Greek myth who loses his lover, Eurydice, and goes to the underworld to retrieve her. He succeeds in getting into the underworld through the power of his music, through the charm of his music. Eurydice is allowed to leave on the condition that that Orpheus not look at her until they're safely out of the underworld. He looks at her, she turns to stone and is lost to him again and with finality. Later, he is pining away, playing his music, and the rocks and stones actually move across the landscape to come closer to hear him. The Maenads, followers of Dionysus, attempt to seduce him, and he ignores their charms, and they fall upon him and tear him to pieces. And so what we have here is then the end of the Orpheus story. Orpheus represented by a severed head. And by the way, the severed head is a common motif in the art of Redon. But the head here is joined to, in a kind of ambiguous way, the lyre, the instrument that Orpheus played. Where are they? Well, it's kind of hard to tell. This looks like a mountainside, and you can see a few flowers glowing against it. Perhaps this is a body of water below. It's uncertain. The coloring is gorgeously exotic, with this oxblood background and peach-colored head, the purplish sky with tones of pink in it. Notice that the painting refers to the visual. Of course, we can see it. It refers to the olfactory with the flowers that one would smell and enjoy the smell of. It also refers to music in sound. So there are at least three senses here. And this is very much in keeping with Baudelaire's notion of correspondences, that one might see sound, one might see music, and one might, in listening to music, one might have colors arise in the mind. One sense experience might substitute or correspond to another. We're looking on the screen here at the work of Paul Seroussier, 1864 to 1927. And this early work of his has a has an odd beginning. This is your textbook. It's called Landscape the Bois d'Amour, the Woods of Love. It also became known as the Talisman. That was painted in 1888 in Brittany at Pont-Aven, and that was the town where an artist community gathered and where Gauguin stood out as the sort of leading figure, mentor to other artists, younger artists, when he was present. And he was present at the time that this was painted. If you look at its medium, it's somewhat surprising. It's very small. This work is about as big as a sheet of paper in front of you, 10 by 8 inches. It's painted on the lid of a cigar box. Oil paint applied to the lid of a cigar box. And it's said that Gauguin guided Serussier in this effort, encouraging him to draw more on his memory, on his imagination, and less on what he saw, and not to mix colors together, but rather to apply colors in their pure state. And you can see that the very shapes here are not mixed together. There are a few gradations, but rather bold areas of color. The work seems to refer maybe very obliquely, very distantly to the landscape. We have a line here that leads upward in a curvilinear manner that suggests some recession into distance. But what are we saying? Who can tell? Maybe masses of trees, maybe reflection down below. Nonetheless, it is I think, a stunning and quite beautiful and very suggestive image. And this came to have a kind of talismanic significance among young painters, a group of painters that identified themselves as the Nabis, the Hebrew word for prophet, a Nabi. This group was formed of a dozen painters who shared ideals, but differed in their specific interests in the subjects that they depicted. One of the founding members of this group was Maurice Denis, whose work we see on the screen. Denis lived between 1870 and 1943. His article defining the definition of neo-traditionalism, I'm translating the French here kind of badly, that became a Nabi manifesto. And within it, he made the quite famous and often repeated statement that it is well to remember that a picture, before being a battle horse, a nude woman, or some anecdote, is essentially a plain surface covered with colors in a certain order. That statement dates in 1890. So he's reminding the reader of the foundational importance, the primary importance of the form of the painting. That is first and foremost an arrangement of shapes on a flat surface. And only secondarily, he's saying here, is it a battle scene? Is it a nude figure, or some anecdote, some genre scene? So this is a kind of inversion of the prior logic about what a painting is. Previously, painting always had to be first some object or some scene that one would recognize. But here he's saying that it's first and foremost an arrangement of forms on a flat surface. Denis was a devout Catholic. He painted many religious images throughout his career. And one of those we see here. This is in your textbook entitled Climbing Mount Calvary. And so it refers to the crucifixion, and indeed there is the figure of Christ represented very simply as a shape bound with a clear contour, holding the cross. And in the distance, we might see here as a kind of silhouette shape the Roman soldiers, the Jewish population of Jerusalem, those that carried out the crucifixion, that observed it. But in the foreground are nuns, and you can see their black habits as they look away from us and move toward Christ, and the white fabric that would frame their faces, just indicated as a thin band. So, while the painting refers to a well-known religious subject, it seems to be more about what's inside the nuns, what the nuns might imagine and feel in their commitment to and their bond to the suffering of Christ, their affinity with Christ's suffering, and their attempt to ascend toward him. They rise from the bottom right of the painting up toward the figure of Christ. They ascend toward him in a kind of paradise-like setting, the ground dotted with flowers. This is not the Calvary that's often depicted as a kind of bleak, barren place, but a verdant, flower-filled place. Another important member of the Nabi group was Edouard Vuillard, 1868 to 1940. And he painted, that I can think of, no religious scenes, but instead primarily genre scenes and to a lesser degree landscapes. He's often referred to as an intimiste. He was drawn to private indoor scenes. He never married, and he always lived with his mother until her death. His mother was a dressmaker, and so the family home was filled with fabrics and patterns, and we see those really coming to the fore in his paintings, which have an emphasis on pattern shapes of wallpaper, furniture, bedspreads, clothing, as this painting illustrates here on the screen. A woman in blue with child from 1899, oil on cardboard, a painting of modest size, about 19 by 22 inches. In all of Vuillard's painting, it's a little hard to pick out figures and exactly what's going on. We can see the baby's face here, below the body of the baby. And here is the mother wearing a blue dress, holding the baby, and seemingly admiring the baby. But it's as if we see everything through a slight veil, which blurs the clarity of the scene and the identity of things. What really stands out about this painting is the patterns of the bed cover, the wallpaper, even furniture, screens, and these things seem to overlap each other, to kind of pile up on top of each other in a way that does suggest collage. The painting seems to be more about the character of the place than the people within, who we can see only rather vaguely. And the place seems both cozy, but also rather claustrophobic in the way these patterns crowd together and surround the figures so closely. I've got a few other examples. This is Breakfast at Madame Vuillard's. Again, notice that the people are not particularly clear. That they, I think I see this as emphasizing the place and its various patterns, the large floor area, the wallpaper, the patterns on the fabrics that enclose the figures rather than the figures themselves. Here's yet one more example labeled the workroom. So this would be the room in which Madame Vuillard assembled dresses for sale. And you can see it's the fabrics and the patterns on those fabrics, as well as the wallpaper. Everything seems flattened out here with a man that looks like Edouard Vuillard himself peeking around the corner to look at the activity taking place within. He occasionally painted something more like a landscape. And so I'm showing you here the Place Ventimille. This would be in Paris. It dates from 1911. And this is painted in distemper on paper. And the paper would be attached then to canvas or to fabric and to a screen. The whole thing is 90 inches wide and 23 inches in height. So we're seeing here a place in Paris. And you can see the winding street across the bottom of the image that surrounds a park-like space. But again, it's the patterns of color and shape that really seem to dominate. And we see just enough of the street to locate this place, to know where we are. Of course, the screen would fold, so where you see these joints, there are 5 separate pieces to the screen, and it can be folded in various configurations. All right, another group I want to mention. Let's see, I need to, you'll excuse me. Well, I seem to have left an image out, so I'm just going to refer to it. I want to mention the Salons of the Rose de la Croix, or Rose Cross Croix. This was a group led by Sar Pélédan. His actual name was Josephin Pélédan, but he took the title Sar, who came to Paris to establish himself as a writer and an art critic. He was a devout Catholic, and he revived Rosicrucianism, which is an esoteric religious cult that had its origins, I think, as far back as the 15th century. It drew on ideas, of course, from Catholicism, but also from the Jewish Kabbalah and from Freemasonry. So it was a religiously oriented kind of occult group. In addition, hearing Wagner in 1888, Pélédan became a devotee of him. He initiated a new salon in 1892 called the Salon of the Rose Croix. And initially, artists who followed the example of Gauguin and the Nabis as well, they were exhibited. Later, Belgians associated with the group Les Vins in Brussels were exhibited, and Hodler, who a Swiss artist that I'll mention later, was exhibited. Like the Impressionist exhibitions, in fact, a variety of styles of art were exhibited at the salons of the Rose Croix, some very traditional and others more progressive. And you've got in your textbook a work by Fernand Knopf, who was a part of the Les Vins group, the 20, in Brussels, as an example of the kind of art that was exhibited in the salons of the Rose Croix. I'm looking at the textbook. That work is dates from 1896, 19 inches by 59 inches long. And you'll see that the style seen there is really quite traditional. The author of the textbook compares it to Ang, and this is apparent in the depiction of the body of the male figure especially. Very precisely drawn, firm contour, moderate in light and shadow. Next to that male figure is an odd hybrid, a woman whose head, which looks portrait-like, is joined to the body of a leopard, and so becomes a sphinx-like form. The woman has the character of the femme fatale, which was a female type that emerged in late 19th century art and literature. And it's the idea of woman, of a kind of independent, confident, and sexually alluring woman who entraps men and leads them astray and leads them to do things leads them into vice that they would ordinarily avoid. This has to do with, of course, the fear of women, and it arises in part due to the growing power and independence that women enjoyed in the 19th century. So that's an example of the work, of a work display at the salons of the Rose Croix. Now, as I said, Knopf was from Belgium and a part of the group Les Vins, the 20. So let me say something about that group, which was formed in Brussels in 1883 as an avant-garde exhibition society. They organized 9 annual exhibitions between 1884 and 1893. And at those exhibitions, not only were their own works shown, but also works of foreigners who were invited to participate, such as Van Gogh in 1889. And that's where he sold the only painting that he sold during his lifetime, the Red Vineyard, and as well as Toulouse-Lautrec. Perhaps the most important among these artists was one named James Ensor. And in your textbook, this work by Ensor, his most important work is discussed. So I'll show you to here, entitled "The Entry of Christ into Brussels, 1888." A large work of a salon grand machine size, 8.5 feet by 12.5 feet in size. This is now in the collection of the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. In its subject matter, there's the figure of Christ here in the very center, very difficult to see, with a vast crowd of contemporary Belgians gathered around the occasion of the big parade. His way of presenting Christ recalls a work that Onsor must have known by Peter Bruegel. This is mentioned in your textbook and reproduced there, and I'll show it to you here on the right-hand side. This is Bruegel's painting of Christ carrying the cross, dating from 1564. So in the very center, difficult to see, is the figure of Christ, fallen down on the ground at this moment. He's carrying the cross, which you can see. Mary here is here in the foreground, sunken into despair and attended by John the Evangelist, and maybe this is Mary Magdalene on the other side. The painting is otherwise filled with people of Bruegel's time, and they've gathered together to see a great spectacle, to enjoy a show. They're riding horses, they're slipping in the mud in places, they're fighting, quarreling, kids are playing, and you can see that this procession is moving toward the circle here in the distance where scaffolds have been set up, and that's where the crucifixion will take place. So the point of this is that really almost no one here, except for the figures in the front, they perceive the message of Christ and its importance and its relevance to their lives. Truth exists in their midst, and yet almost no one is aware of it or responsive to it. So Onsor has done something quite similar in locating Christ within his own time in Brussels in 1888. However, the figures are not shown as we might expect, wearing the clothing and having the hairstyles, the patterns of dress of the time, but they're shown as grotesque, as cartoon-like characters with masks. And here, for example, in the foreground, a guy with a green hat and a skull-like face. And this would stem from Onsor's great familiarity with costumery and masks, because his mother ran such a shop and sold this stuff. So he grew up around costumes and masks. Here they take on the symbolism of duplicity. We wear masks, we present ourselves in one way to the world around us, in the way that we want to be seen and perceived, but the underlying truth is something quite different. As your text tells you, there's a political dimension to this as well, because the sign across the top reads, "Vive la sociale," long live the socialist state. There was political turbulence in Belgium at the time. Onsor, I think, sympathized with the plight of workers, and so the sign it supports their cause, and perhaps also suggests that this would be Christ's sentiments as well, to support the needs of the common people and their claims for economic justice and political freedom. All right, I'm going to mention two other painters. And the first of those is Ferdinand Hodler, who lived in Switzerland, although exhibited elsewhere, including Paris. And he lived between 1853 and 1918. Now, his early work is quite naturalistic. It looks a good bit like Impressionism, but as your textbook explains, he went through an artistic conversion in mid-career. You have a work in your textbook labeled Night that dates from 1890, in which you see figures sleeping singly and in pairs, and crouching over one is the black shrouded figure of death. Um, and this startles and frightens the man who awakens to see this. I'm going to show you a couple landscapes. So uh, Adler begins to paint the landscape in a way that's natural, less naturalistic. It certainly looks plausible, and yet there's a kind of um, uh, extraordinary order in his landscape that suggests we're to read these things as symbols of some underlying idea. Here, for example, in Autumn Evening, the date's from 1892, an easel-sized painting, 39 by 51 inches. We're looking down a road that leads over the horizon, and we see trees uh, that have lost many of their leaves. The leaves are piled up along the sides of the road, as you can see. The trees are scattered in a more or less even rhythm down the road, marking off units of space, and they lead toward the setting sun. I think it's easy uh, to imagine or to interpret this symbolically. The road being something like the path of life, the journey of life. One immediately thinks of the paintings of Friedrich and how they do much the same thing. That is, use natural phenomena to suggest the nature of human experience. We might see the trees here then as markers that indicate experiences or the passing of years, the unfolding of time toward toward an end uh, that we cannot know for sure until we get there. And I'll show you one other work by Adler entitled "The Weisshorn von Montana" from 1915. Again, a landscape that seems kind of preternaturally organized and ordered, with the clouds in the sky forming bands reflected in the water. And so we've got all these parallel bands of reflection, mountains, uh, lake bank, and clouds in the sky. The last artist I'll talk about is Edvard Munch, who lived between 1863 and 1944. A Norwegian, he grew up in Oslo, was then named Christiania. He won, as an artist in his 20s, he won a scholarship that allowed him to come to Paris and to study there for a time. And in Paris, he saw the art of Gauguin, and that changed him forever. And he said, as I remarked earlier, I believe, in class, that he decided that painting should no more be about genre scenes or the everyday, but rather they should be about basic human emotions. And he would then go on to develop what he called the frieze of life. This was a series of paintings, about 24 in all, they were exhibited a number of times in German cities, where he spent a good bit of his mid-career. I'm going to show you, here is a black and white um, photograph of one of these exhibitions. So we're seeing in this upper band the oil paintings that make up the frieze of life. And I can recognize this one as Madonna. This one is, let's see. Well, here's a painting that has to do with the Garden of Eden. I'm sorry, I don't remember more than that. There's a painting of the kiss over here. But notice this painting right in the middle of the wall. It occupies a prominent position. By the way, these are prints at a lower level. The print shown off, exhibited below the cycle of paintings. The painting above then is the Dance of Life, which many of you know. A painting that dates from 1899 to 1900. Here it is. Whoops. So I gotta go back. Here it is, 4 feet by 6 feet in size. And the painting that is clearly based on an underlying idea that has to do with the cycle of life. Now, your textbook identifies the female figures as embodying states of youth, middle age, and old age. As many of you have heard me say, Munch thought of woman with a capital W, women in totality, as being at one and the same time saints, whores, and hapless devotees. And I think we can see those identities in these figures as well. Um, these states or identities are shown through the very subtle cues. For example, the woman on the left, youthful, she's got flowers on her white dress. Her hands move away from her body in a way that suggests awakening sexuality, uh, a growing openness to engagement with the world, and particularly with the male gender. In the center, the woman clothed in the red dances with a man now. Their eyes are locked together. But notice that the red color, which of course would signify passion and love, maybe also suffering, uh, it extends in a line around the male figure and so suggests entrapment. So Monk seems to suggest that she's a kind of femme fatale figure. And then the woman on the right-hand side, aged, she could also be read as the hapless devotee, the woman who is now alone, um, who is left alone and without connection. And notice that her arms are locked against her side and making her very much a closed form. So just through the different gestures of the three women, we have the suggestion of three different states and a kind of unfolding of a pattern in life more generally. The the orb, presumably the sun, um, in the midsummer Norway and its reflection, could be read as a male female uh, pair of forms, male female symbols. That is the long reflection, kind of phallic form, and the round form in the sky, and the female form. You notice that there are other couples in the distance dancing in a kind of here clearly a lascivious way with the leering face of the male figure. The landscape painted in the most simple way imaginable. Bands of blue for the water, for the sky, a band of green, interrupted only by the flower next to the youthful figure. In my mind, a very powerful painting uh, with its meaning expressed through simplified shapes, bold colors, um, and a lot of forms that whose meaning is admittedly kind of open-ended and ambiguous, but highly suggestive, in keeping with the nature of symbolism. I'll show you just one other work by Munch. This is called Death in the Sick Room, and this stems from a great deal from personal experience. Munch had sisters, his mother died, his father died when Munch was still a teenager, and so death was a common experience in Munch's youthful life. This looks like his sister that he painted a number of times, and this might be Munch himself, who looks away in the corner, sorrowfully, having difficulty in dealing with the sadness of the occasion. And again, the room is painted in a very simple way, with a few lines that suggest a deep space, and the wall rendered as a unmodulated area of green. Okay, with that, I'll stop. I hope you get some sense of symbolism in the various forms it takes, in the way in which these paintings are ambiguous and open-ended, but clearly suggest a lot more than meets the eye on the surface.